Smartphones, these little addictive demons in our pockets, they have a lot to answer for. If you believe Jonathan Haidt, which I do, they've destroyed teenagers' mental health. It's also pretty obvious, I think, to everyone that by polarizing politics, they've broken politics to some degree. But a new Substack piece by Times columnist James Marriott goes even further. He says smartphones might be destroying rationality and modern civilization itself. The viral article is called The Dawn of the Post-Literate Society and the End of Civilization. And the arguments really come in three parts. So first, he includes data showing reading has declined. So this chart from the FT's John Burr Murdoch shows how the number of American teenagers saying they hardly ever read has increased dramatically in the last 2 decades. Then he shows evidence that since 2012, there has been a dramatic fall in global PISA scores. So it makes it seem like sort of our general overall skills are just declining. Now, for anyone who's ever found themselves down an hour-long rabbit hole of mundane 20-second TikTok videos, none of this is particularly surprising. None of this seems like, oh, wow, that's a really interesting idea. Right? We get that. We can all see we're getting slightly dumber from these very, very short videos. Marriott's argument, though, goes much further than this. And I think that the original point in the piece concerns how a society less used to reading may become less rational and ultimately completely dysfunctional. So this is a segment from the article. So it says, the world of print is orderly, logical, and rational. In books, knowledge is classified, comprehended, connected, and put in its place. Books make arguments, propose theses, develop ideas. To engage with the written word, the media theorist Neil Postman wrote, means to follow a line of thought which requires considerable powers of classifying, inference-making, and reasoning. And Marriott draws on historians who say the reading revolution of the 18th century and the rise of a literate public was an essential prerequisite for a functioning democracy. Without that, we lack the reasonableness and the ability to think critically that makes democracy work. Instead, without that, we risk falling into the mystical, emotional, and antagonistic ways of thinking that dominated pre-literate societies. And this is a foreboding conclusion reached by James Marriott. He says, we may be about to find out that it is not possible to run the most advanced civilization in the history of the planet with the intellectual apparatus of a pre-literate society. As you can probably tell, I found the piece fascinating, as did thousands of others on Substack. So I thought I'd get James on to discuss the piece. And I started by asking him to expand on the first part of his thesis, namely the evidence that reading and literacy is, in fact, in decline.
I think this is the difficult part of the argument, because the idea that people are reading less and getting stupider, it's like an age-old theme of opinion columnists. People have been writing this for decades now. I think there probably has always been some truth in it, and I think there's probably a longer story here that's worth talking about. But recently, in the last kind of 5 years, the evidence has become pretty unequivocal. There have been a number of surveys out. The really striking one was one earlier this year that found that reading for pleasure in American adults had declined by 40%. There was a similar survey a couple of years ago of British adults that found that a third of them had given up reading. The really remarkable thing for me was this OECD report that came out at the end of last year that found that literacy was declining or stagnating in most developed countries, which is a really remarkable and kind of crazy thing to discover, because we'd assumed we were always getting more literate. These are countries with the most advanced education systems in the world. For literacy to be declining in developed countries, something really serious is happening. And like once upon a time, you might have said, has there been a war? Has the education system collapsed? And, to me, the answer is pretty obviously smartphones. But the data is just hard to ignore now. And I don't think, I've written about this a lot and spoken about it quite a bit now. I haven't really come across anyone who seriously disputes the data. It's there, and I think it's pretty convincing.
And I suppose the most obvious sort of time when this argument was being made before was, I suppose, the mass spread of television, when people would have said, oh, everyone's just watching TV, they're not reading books anymore. I mean, I remember hearing that when I was a kid, sort of people saying kids just watch TV, they're not reading books. Was that visible in the data, or do you think that was a moral panic, and now we're seeing something which, the data just shows to be more significant this time around when it comes to smartphones compared to TVs?
Teasing these things historically is always difficult. I think both things can be true. I think to some degree there was a moral panic around television, but to some degree that moral panic was also justified. Some interesting studies of declines in IQ. There's a study of, I think it's the Norwegian military, is one of the kind of gold standard studies of IQ declines, seems to find that IQ was declining in people born after, I think, 1975. And that suggests that, if we do think the media environment affects intelligence, which I think it does, that might have been a TV-related decline. I think it's a kind of easy thing to oversimplify this idea that there was one screen revolution with smartphones that was kicked off in 2007 with the iPhone and has transformed our culture. There are more continuities than we think, and I think smartphones are step change. The fact they're portable and that you can literally always be constantly entertained by your smartphone is an important step. But like, people were watching a lot of TV in the 80s and 90s, so screen time isn't totally a new phenomenon. I wouldn't be surprised if it did have effects on intelligence, prior to the smartphone.
You've put your money where your mouth is. You don't have a smartphone, which we might talk about later. For now, though, I suppose the most interesting thing about your Substack piece, and I think why it's gone viral, is because it's not just that you're talking about the decline of literacy and the relationships between smartphones, which I think has been in the ether for a while, but you were talking about how this could have a fundamental civilizational effect. This is not just it's sad because people are reading less. You think that a literate society is fundamentally different to a post-literate society, and we should be very worried about that. I suppose worried, potentially an understatement. So talk me through your argument about how this could have civilizational impacts.
I know it sounds kind of crazily overdramatic because, from one perspective, reading books is just a hobby, like any other hobby. But a lot of this comes from really fascinating work and argument that was done in the mid-20th century by media theorists like Marshall McLuhan, Walter Ong, Neil Postman, you mentioned a bit later, about the way that writing and literacy isn't just like a pastime. It kind of structures our whole civilization. It structures our consciousness. It structures the way that our minds work. And I guess one of the fundamental points about literacy is that it shapes the way that we think. There are certain kinds of thinking that are inseparable from reading and writing. I think is an important point, and one that it's a little bit hard to appreciate. The way I put it in the piece was that if you try and imagine someone writing a philosophy book, or imagine someone trying to write a long history book, the only way you can have a long and complicated philosophical idea is by writing it out in a book. There's no other way to develop like Kant's Critique of Pure Reason other than the form of a book. You couldn't just think it up in your head. You couldn't just speak it spontaneously out loud. That form of advanced thinking is inseparable from literacy. You have to write a sentence down, you cross it out, you refine it, you come back to it, you meditate on it. And literacy is basically inseparable from this kind of complex, analytic form of thinking that's fundamental to a load of disciplines that I think are like foundational to our civilization. Serious political discourse, science as a product of literacy, that's uncontroversial to say to historians of science, history, serious policy discussion you can't really do other than in like long books, well, not necessarily long books, but books, long form text, journal articles, magazine articles. And if you don't have long form text, you're basically shutting yourself off from all kinds of thinking. And I kind of think we're already seeing that actually.
Walter Ong is something I put on my reading list. For now, it keeps popping up in Substacks I read. Obviously, Substacks aren't whole books, but I like to think that they can still contribute to some degree to a literate society. On this question of sort of oral societies and literary societies or literate societies, I think this is one of the things that's most interesting about your essay. And I suppose, I think the way it rung true to lots of people is they're looking at political discourse right now, especially sort of Candace Owens, Russell Brand, sort of Alex Jones, people who are literally talking about demons and ghosts. And they're thinking, this is weird. This is crazy. Like, how did this happen? And I think the argument you're putting forward is this isn't actually new. It's a return. It's a return to an oral society, because when you get your information verbally instead of via text, then it is sort of harder or less necessary to make a logical, orderly argument. And the idea of sort of persuasion via emotions, via storytelling becomes much more important. And I suppose the argument you're making is we're in some way returning to an oral society, and that could explain what seems to be a bit of a return to mysticism and what to many people might look like sort of complete irrationality in political debate.
Yeah, totally. And I mean, it's kind of amazing. That Walter Ong book, Orality and Literacy, is a fantastic book and seems kind of weirdly prescient to read because he describes a lot of the features of discourse in pre-literate societies. It's angrier, it's more confrontational, it's less rational. And you kind of read his description of discourse in kind of tribal pre-literate cultures, and it's very similar to the kind of discourse that you get on like YouTube or TikTok. And there are a number of reasons for this. Print, as I said, kind of fosters more kind of analytic, reflective, critical thought you don't have talking person to person. You can't pin down spoken phrases in the same way you can pin down written phrases to analyze them. The other thing is that print is like an unnaturally logical medium of communication. It's very unemotional. Books can be somewhat emotional, but if you're trying to persuade someone of a point in the pages of a book, you only have a very limited armory of rhetorical techniques at your disposal. Basically the only thing you can do is attempt to persuade them sentence by sentence, fairly rationally, fairly logically, using evidence and getting them to your point of view that way. If you're trying to persuade someone of a point in conversation or in the form of a video, you have a whole other array of emotional appeals you can make. You can shout, you can cry, you can be charming. If it's a video, you can play music, you can show images. None of these things are related to logical argument. There's no reason why being charming or crying or shouting should make an argument more persuasive. And yet it does, in person or over a video. And human beings are not rational animals, and we're clearly very susceptible to these kind of non-logical emotional appeals. And the sort of amazing thing that print did for the hundreds of years that it formed our culture was that it basically formed public discourse that was cut off from these non-logical appeals, or from many of them. And print is just, because you can do less in a book, you're much more confined to logical argument, and you just miss those kind of non-logical emotional appeals that are like filling our culture and making it, as you say, really feel like, almost like parodically like a kind of free literate society, like Jordan Peterson being attacked by demons. I think Tucker Carlson was attacked by a demon as well. And it really is, it's almost too on the nose. I think even Walter Ong would be kind of surprised that it seemed that similar.
When we're talking about literary societies or literate societies and oral societies, is this about elites or masses? And I suppose because there's an argument that's made that sort of, I suppose Plato and Aristotle, they couldn't have written their books, or they couldn't have spoken their books, let's say. I think the Iliad is sort of, that's one of the first books that was written when the Greeks rediscovered writing. And before that, sort of all information had been oral. It had been oral, and obviously they didn't have podcasts back then, so sort of passed on through memory and custom and ritual. But when you're talking about this oral versus literate society, is it about elites or the masses? And I suppose on the masses issue, my understanding is that it wasn't until, I think the 1550s that sort of you get a radical increase in people reading in Holland and Britain, and then sort of a century after that, it spreads to the rest of Europe. So which of those sort of transformations are you talking about?
I think it's a continuous thing. I mean, literacy obviously begins to expand with the invention of the printing press at the beginning of the 15th century. And, by the 17th century, literacy is fairly widespread in Britain. In my essay, the point that I took was this phenomenon called the Reading Revolution, which took place in the middle of the 18th century, which was literacy began to spread, education improved, books became a lot cheaper. And I think there's an argument that this is the first moment in history when ordinary people really begin to read properly and begin to read a lot. And that has pretty immediate political consequences in the 18th century. I think the kind of crucial transformation that happens then is the move from a society where knowledge is predominantly the preserve of elites, and you have to be highly educated and you have to be wealthy to have access to knowledge. In the middle of the 18th century, suddenly those barriers to knowledge fall apart. And there are all these amazing reports like peasants reading, artisans reading, apprentices reading, poor soldiers reading newspapers. And there's this huge democratization of knowledge. And that, this is not just me saying this. This is an argument made by a historian of the 18th century, Tim Blanning. Is one of the factors that brings down the Anton regime in Europe. Feudal Europe just can't survive the democratization of knowledge because suddenly ordinary people can read about abuses of power. They're exposed to new philosophical ideas about the rights of man, about the equality of all human beings. And the feudal world of Europe, which very much relied on the ignorance of the population and impressive visual appeals of kings, parading around with firework displays and showing themselves to the public in impressive clothes. This stuff really kind of crumbled in the face of the democratization of knowledge and also the new analytic and skeptical habits of thought that were fostered by print in the population.
Let's talk about some challenges to this argument, I suppose, and we'll begin with the history, because you make the argument, which I think is powerful, that sort of the printing press was essential to the rise of democracy because it gave sort of a much broader section of society sort of the analytical and critical thinking skills to sort of challenge hierarchies and the status quo. It also, though, of course, did that because it democratized information. So it was just simply much easier for you to spread ideas, whereas before it could maybe only happen through the church. Now all sorts of people could get access to a printing press and try and publish a book that people could read. Even if you take your argument about post-literate society seriously and says, so maybe we all do get a little bit less analytical and we all do get a little bit more irrational and all a bit more persuaded by anger and emotion, we will have an even more democratized sort of circumstance when it comes to the transmission of information. So could it be that two things cancel out? I suppose what I'm saying is, of course, we're not going to go back to an era before the printing press, because while we might all become a bit less reasonable, we are going to have access to more information from more people than ever. So might it be that the two sort of trends come out in the wash and democracy can be saved?
I agree. I think it's a good point. I don't think it will work out like that. I think there's a distinction that needs to be made between more informed, between better informed. And I guess the revolutionary thing about print and about the proliferation of books in the 18th century was that it wasn't just more information was available, better information was available. The way that text structures knowledge, I think, is a crucial part of the revolution in literacy. It's not just that information was sprayed to the population. Information that's presented in books is very richly structured, it's very dense, it's, as we were saying earlier, it's more logical, it proposes serious arguments. And I think it's that kind of logical and kind of highly structured nature of text-based information that was kind of crucial to the revolutionary implications of print in the 18th century, because it gave people the tools not just to know more about elites, but to properly analyze and rationally take apart the basis of their power. It was kind of time of great works of political theory. People in books logically taking apart the social structures that prevailed in society. So I guess my first point is that books structure information better than smartphones do. And even though it's theoretically true that smartphones do technically give you access to more information, that's not really what smartphone manufacturers want you to be doing with your phone. And yes, potentially we could all spend our entire lives on Wikipedia, informing ourselves deeply about the world. The business model of social media companies and of smartphone manufacturers doesn't tend towards that use of smartphones. They want you on TikTok. They want you, mindlessly scrolling and absorbing ads so they can track your data, sell you better ads, that whole kind of screen-based business model. That is basically that's again the destruction of knowledge, not purveying knowledge. And yeah, I'm sure there are people who do spend time on their smartphones reading Wikipedia, but I think that's unfortunately a minority pursuit, and that's basically not what smartphones are designed to do.
You've potentially answered what was going to be my next question, but I'll put it to you anyway, which is another challenge, which I suppose is from my own personal experience, because lots of the times I read about sort of this post-literate society is by people who seem to have always really loved books. Now, I sort of, as a young person, did like reading novels, for example. I did always, even at university, find it quite difficult to sit down and concentrate with a book. And that was before the age of smartphones. And while I try and read as much as possible, it is definitely the case that podcasts have just dramatically increased the amount of information and knowledge and context that is in my brain, because I can listen to, whole periods of history while I'm walking my dog. So I feel like for me, it has had a really educating impact having a smartphone. I on this program, I'm always talking about how much I hate smartphones and these tech companies, but podcasts have been, I think, unambiguously very good for me. And then actually, even with Twitter and especially with Substack, I do find that it does allow me to have more of a critical engagement with information in the world than books would, because a book takes you a long time to read, right? It is, and often you'll read one book and then you'll read a related book and then you'll read a related book. Whereas with Twitter, with Substack, I can read one argument, the opposite perspective, a third perspective. I can read 10 different perspectives on the same issue in about 2 hours. I can look at one sort of chart and then sort of 10 minutes later see someone telling me why that chart is actually somewhat misleading, which wouldn't happen if I was reading a book. And so I suppose I wonder if are you at risk of understating the benefits of modern technology when it comes to our information environment?
I'm sure I am. And I guess everything you say is right. And I guess I'm talking not about every single book is superior to every single TikTok video. That's patently not true. I guess it's more about average effects. And you're probably an unusually critical and curious user of social media. I think if you look at what's in the podcast charts, and I think if you look at what the most popular tweets are, and I think you look at the kind of content that does well in social media, the general and overall effect of the internet is that it privileges like nonsense and hatred and lies. I mean, if you look at the most popular podcasters in America, they're not like science podcasts. They're not like rational political podcasts. It's Joe Rogan, it's Candace Owens, it's Russell Brand. And I think that is, again, it does come back to the kind of particular informational biases contained in particular media of communication. Books have to make their points logically and persuade you, and it's hard for a book to be persuasive and to be successful if it's not to some degree rationally explained and persuasive. Podcasts, that doesn't really apply in the same way. You know, if you wrote down everything that Candace Owens said and tried to publish it in a book, it would make no sense whatsoever at all. But because this kind of spoken medium is much more forgiving of irrational nonsense and is much more accepting of like emotionalized thinking, the overall bias of podcasts, despite the existence of many excellent ones, is towards, I think, like extremism and irrational thinking. And that's why, you know, Candace Owens could never have had a career in the late 20th century in the age of print. Now she's one of the most famous people in America. And that's because the media bias of, you know, the internet accommodates so much better. And I think that's overall a bad thing. But I'm not saying it's like inevitably in every single instance a bad thing. There aren't some people who can maneuver their way around that information environment intelligently.
So I'm allowed to keep my job. That was going to be my next question. Because obviously I'm a professional YouTuber, which means, you know, according to you, I do have the capacity to mislead people because my arguments can be much weaker because I'm speaking orally instead of writing them down. Should I look elsewhere?
Obviously not. And this is kind of the paradox. And it's one that I fall into too. You know, I spend time tweeting. You know, I've appeared on podcasts, I've appeared on YouTube videos, and if you were to quit your job as a YouTuber, and if I were to never post on social media, nobody would ever listen to us. And we have to work with the information environment that we're given and that we live with. And it would be sort of absurd to try and think that we could persuade people of the dangers of the internet while never engaging with the internet and only trying to communicate through books and stuff.
I want to talk about the future and where you think this is going and read a quote from you from this essay, which I thought was quite fantastic. So you say, "We may be about to find out that it is not possible to run the most advanced civilization in the history of the planet with the intellectual apparatus of a pre-literate society." That is, I suppose, depressing, worrying, apocalyptic, one might say. Where do you see this going? Are you seriously considering civilizational collapse?
Maybe collapse is putting it too strongly, but I do think that technological revolutions tend to portend societal revolutions. If you think of the impact that print had in Europe in the 15th century and afterwards, it transformed Europe. It destroyed, you know, the old idea of Christendom. It split into you know, the Catholic world and the Protestant world. It destroyed the old feudal hierarchies. Mediums of communication are profoundly important and really do transform societies. And my feeling really is that democracy, and especially liberal democracy, is basically a product of a literate society. There's no modern democracy in history that has existed without a literate population. And I think if your political system isn't informed by long-form text, the ability to reason at length, the ability to argue over complex ideas in print, there's no historical precedent for a democracy surviving without these things. I mean, I think it's pretty obvious what's happening in America in front of our eyes. You know, there's almost no more obviously post-literate politician than Donald Trump, who's made the perfect transition from the world of TV to the world of Twitter and the world of screens and Truth Social or whatever. And democracy is falling apart because all the intellectual apparatus on which democracy depends, which is rational argument, complex ideas, a relatively cool emotional temperature of debate, that just doesn't exist in America anymore. We're in the kind of mad, chaotic, pre-literate, mystical, irrational world of the screen. And yeah, it seems that it's almost remarkable how quickly it's happening. And I think even people like Neil Postman would have been surprised that the kind of relationship between screens and democracy, or the relationship between print and democracy and screens and like destruction of democracy, was quite so stark. And I think, you know, I'm surprised by it.
I suppose that analysis of why modern democracy has gone haywire, which I think most people will agree, it has to a large degree. Are you potentially sort of looking with rose-tinted glasses at the 20th century? Because I suppose it was maybe often the case that people weren't particularly rational politically, that people, when they voted, hadn't really thought particularly seriously about the policy platforms of the different parties and couldn't explain to you, why the economic policy of that guy was better than the other guy. But what was different then compared to now was you had a lot more gatekeeping, right? So it was the case that to even become a presidential candidate for one of those parties, you'd need a lot of people in elite society. You'd need the New York Times. You'd need lots of people with establishment credentials, essentially, to say you're a legitimate person. And only then would you get the chance to properly go out and try and get the masses to vote for you. And so the real difference, I mean, I accept that the data is pretty clear that mass populations have become a bit less literate than they were in the mid-20th century. Although actually, no, I suppose the data is clear they've become a bit less literate than they were in the 2010s. I'm not actually sure if they're less literate than they were in the mid-20th century. But anyway, it seems to me that potentially a bigger difference is the collapse of the gatekeepers. And then you're making a more controversial argument, which is to say, bring back the gatekeepers. Obviously, bring back reading, bring back books it's very difficult for people to disagree with that. But to say, bring back the gatekeepers, that's a more controversial argument to make.
It is, and I was making precisely that argument on a panel last weekend, and I got booed. And it is a difficult one to make, and there's obviously a lot wrong with the gatekeeping class that exists in the 20th century. It is also true that the gatekeeping class that exists in the 20th century did kind of impose minimum standards of rational thought on people who wanted to participate in public life. So if you wanted to be a presidential candidate at the end of the 20th century, there were all kinds of things you could and couldn't say that were determined by the media, but you did have to sign up to like a belief in science. It would have been utterly politically destructive in the late 20th century to deny the efficacy of vaccines, for instance. Like the New York Times, for all its faults, would have shredded you and your political career would have been over. It would have been utterly, politically catastrophic to argue against free speech in the way that Donald Trump does every day on Truth Social. The mainstream media would have shredded you, and rightly. It would have been politically catastrophic to argue against, like toleration and all these kind of liberal principles. I know there's probably a difficult Novara media argument to make, but I think to some degree were enforced by gatekeepers in the old media. It's not to say those gatekeepers were anything like perfect, but they did hold people to a kind of minimum standard of tolerance and rationality that, we can see did allow democracy, liberal democracy, to kind of thrive and survive in the late 20th century. And that's not to say that the establishment and the media weren't in need of reform and didn't get things wrong. They patently did a lot. But I guess perhaps looking at history, we might say that was, as Churchill said of democracy, the worst option except for all the others. I guess the other point that I want to make is that I think there's a kind of idea that social media has brought us into this totally democratic world where everyone can have a voice. And if you just speak up, your voice will be heard and you will have the ability to speak to people. That's totally erroneous. Everything we know about the way that social media platforms are run says that there are still gatekeepers. The gatekeepers are algorithms, and what they're promoting is rage and fear and, on Twitter, pretty explicitly racism. And this idea that we kind of now have moved to this more democratic world of speech is completely false. Anyone can speak on social media. Who gets heard on social media depends on the algorithm picking you up. And if you want to get picked up by the algorithm, you should be saying something pretty horrible. Because if you're saying something rational or reasonable, you've got a much greater chance of being left behind. So, I guess partly, yes, I think you can underrate elites and the kind of standards they impose on discourse. And secondly, elites are still controlling our discourse. It's just slightly more opaque because it's happening via algorithm. It's not immediately obvious in a way that it is when you have a newspaper delivered to you every morning.
Lots of people often say that everyone thinks that when they were in their 20s, the world was the best. But it does seem like there was a period, I suppose, when the most horrific of the Sun headlines had gone. So you didn't have page 3 anymore. There was a certain liberal standard which was being imposed on the tabloids before the rise of Candace Owens and everything went crazy on X. So maybe if we could just stay there for a little bit longer, things would have been okay. I want to move on to a question asked by a famously voracious leader, Lenin. What is to be done? And I suppose this would be a good time to ask you to talk about your experience of dumping your smartphone and moving to a dumb phone.
What is to be done? I'm pretty pessimistic, and I tend to think that, I don't know, there's been no previous technological communications revolution that an opinion columnist has been able to stand in the path of and say, look, this is a very bad idea, we should all stop, and it's stopped. I think if there is an answer, as you say, I sometimes think it sounds makes me sound like a crank, and people sometimes think that I'm being a crank when I say get rid of your smartphone. But I really sincerely think that it's incredibly sinister and dystopian that these addictive entertainment devices made by some of the wealthiest, most powerful, and most sinister people in the world have basically become virtually mandatory in society. It's increasingly difficult to live without a smartphone. And I think if it's possible to get by without one, try it. And I think if there's a minority of people in society who are willing to give up their phones and live without their phones, we can, perhaps preserve a little kind of corner of freedom for people who just don't want to live their lives dominated by addictive entertainment devices. And the more people do it, I think the more we can ward off what I fear will increasingly happen, which is that it'll basically be impossible to live without one. Things like digital ID threaten to make smartphones, almost compulsory, I think. And if there are enough people who are able to stand up and say, we're living without smartphones, you can maybe kind of stop some of the total compulsory imposition of them by the government, for instance.
I think Jonathan Haidt has shown a bit of a way for this when it comes to sort of kids with smartphones, because there now has been a genuine movement against kids with smartphones. And I think, we are now moving in the right direction after basically having given a whole generation of kids a bunch of digital cigarettes or putting something really addictive in their pocket that was destroying their minds. Final question, on your dumb phone, can you get podcasts?
You can, yeah. And actually, I guess part of my argument is more moderate than it sounds, which is that this phone, I'm not really meaning to become a brand ambassador for this particular dumb phone. It's called the Chin F21 Pro, or maybe Quin, Qin. You have to buy it on AliExpress. It's from China. So I don't, potentially, as people always tell me, I'm being spied on by the Chinese government or whatever. It's a pretty decent compromise. It has Spotify, it has WhatsApp, it has Google Maps, so you can sort of survive in the 21st century. But it doesn't have TikTok, and it doesn't have Twitter or Facebook. And I think it sort of functions in the way that smartphone manufacturers often want to lie to us that their products function, which is that it's a tool. It works for you, and it assists your progress through life. It's not trying to swallow your attention and your time and, feed you far-right memes all the time. And I think it's a pretty decent compromise. It's not that hard to do. And I would urge people, if they think they can try it, give it a go and see how you get on.
I have considered it, but I have to come up with 4 different news stories a day for this show, and I think it would be difficult without Twitter and without having an internet browser on my phone. James Marriott, thank you so much for joining me. I do recommend everyone listening to this to go and read your Substack piece on a post-literate society. Just remind our viewers, what's your Substack called?
It's called Cultural Capital, and the piece is called The Dawn of the Post-Literate Society.